Thanks for joining us for Measuring ROI, Reckoning Over Impracticalities. I am Cheryl Darrett-Boychuk, Director of Institutional Relations at INTCAS US. INTCAS stands for Intelligent Communities Around Students. We help colleges, universities, and boarding schools attract, recruit, and manage international students in a safe, compliant, and efficient way. We've been operating in the UK for the past 5 years, and I've been hired to launch INTCAS in the US. Now, I've placed all of our participants on mute, but you're most welcome to ask a question at any time via our Twitter hashtag AskINCAS. So let's first address the title we chose. Of course, ROI means return on investment, but we thought we'd play on that a little bit. When I see the word reckoning, my mind goes to a day of reckoning, or the time when one is called to account for one's actions or to fulfill one's promises or obligations. Impracticalities refer to kind of idealistic notions on a few fronts, revolving around the misconception that every metric can be clearly and consistently defined. As you probably know, international student recruitment is complicated. But we're developing tools that facilitate the analysis. I've been researching ROI for the past 20 years or so, writing chapters about it in a few books, and publishing and editing a number of resources within the NAFSA site. Here's what I've learned. 50 years ago, investing in international recruitment really didn't need much justification. It was the right thing to do for so many reasons. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Many colleagues have become obsessed with big data in recent years. That could be a very positive development as long as we know how to use those figures to ultimately advance global student mobility. I'd say soon a culture of evidence will prevail. Now, before we break into the models, let's manage expectations about how these tools are designed. Measuring ROI is not simple, but other industries share similar challenges. How do you measure the value of a global brand? Some metrics are black and white, like the figures on a balance sheet, but lots of other variables are involved. It's not a perfect science. Assumptions must be made. And so it is with ROI in international recruitment. Another example lies in investment strategy. Portfolio managers seek to achieve the best possible trade-off between risk and return. So how do you figure out the asset allocations in your portfolio, balancing the obvious hope for adequate returns while considering that you'd really rather not invest in companies with questionable child labor practices? How do you invest in safe but low return investments versus risky but higher return investments? So how does that relate to us? Many campuses today would consider China and India relatively crowded markets, but they consistently provide steady returns. At least that's been the case over the past few years. It's always subject to change. Emerging markets, on the other hand, may be considered higher risk, but could generate greater returns over the long term. Indonesia might fall into this category for some campuses. Now, we absolutely run the risk of oversimplifying here. About 10 years ago, we thought the best that we could do would be to collect a series of case studies so colleagues would be able to match their institutional type, enrollment size, and maybe even geography. Then they'd be able to compare themselves against those case studies and gauge success that way. As you might guess, there are some real shortcomings to that approach. Here's one example. This colleague initially learned about an agent from Busan at a workshop in Miami. He ended up participating in one of the agent's events in Korea. He then booked a summer presentation in Busan exclusively for his campus, where 10 students showed up. He thought, what a waste. Within a month, however, 4 of those students enrolled, with each one spending about 3 years at his campus. Gross returns seemed impressive. Obviously, this example is grossly oversimplified. What about staff salaries and the time factor? This case study covered about 4 years. What else happened during that time that could have impacted this return on investment? Another case study from a few years ago dealt with domestic travel, such as visits to foreign embassies in DC and establishing relationships with sponsored programming agencies. Anecdotally, this type of recruitment activity also generated really impressive ROI. The rest of the story is that for one reason or another, The majority of those Saudi students did not stay at this campus to complete their studies. So another flaw in any oversimplified ROI formula relates to the fact that retention rates impact your ROI exponentially, and those factors should certainly be considered. So while those case studies can be interesting, they're not terribly helpful. I'd say the most effective tool would not necessarily compare the individual results of different institutions, but consider more comprehensive results of the same institution over time. In that way, each user is the master of his or her own outcome. Obviously, the more robust your data, the better the results. Your analysis is only as good as your data. And you must define parameters that are measured consistently over time. So as colleagues come and go, the underlying philosophy of your campus's ROI metrics remain the same. As always, balance is key. There are many ways for an investment portfolio manager to arrive at different but equally efficient portfolios. Similarly, there is not one perfect way for every campus to recruit international students. It is, however, critical to monitor your portfolio carefully and shift direction where appropriate. But how do we get there? The industry is struggling with scores of different input and output sources that we manually enter into an antiquated Excel spreadsheet. There's got to be a better way. In my mind, there are two ways to approach the issue. Option A, manually feed that data from all those different sources into one tool to make some sense out of the ROI analysis over time. It's not terribly efficient, but it's a step in the right direction. Option B, use one ecosystem where the users themselves feed data into a sophisticated silo. INTCAS can be that ecosystem. It's a platform which assembles all the stakeholders of global education and hosts all the relevant data for each of them to analyze return on investment. So let's hop over to these practical tools. As a temporary solution, my colleagues and I developed ROIIE.com, available free for colleagues to input their own variables. We actually launched this tool at the NAFSA conference in Denver, thanks to George Kasenga from the University of Colorado, Denver, and Angelica Ricos from Merrimack College up in Boston. The model's been really well received. So what kind of variables do we need to consider in any ROI equation? Not surprisingly, you'll see the usual suspects of salaries, IT, marketing campaigns, travel and conferences, commissions. But let's also consider the amount of time you invest in particular initiatives. This is especially relevant for colleagues who are responsible for distinct areas in the office. For example, marketing and recruitment, processing applications, including credential evaluation, as well as international student services after the students arrive on campus. How much time do you actually spend on recruitment? It's a really important question. Then, of course, you'll need to input the numbers of students that resulted from those recruitment efforts. On the output side, let's consider the revenue from year one in terms of tuition, fees, room and board for different categories of students. One of the many beauties of this model is that if a particular data field is not relevant to your situation, then simply ignore it. Now, because we plan to measure results consistently over time, let's consider tuition and fees beyond year one, as well as parental donations and alumni donations. And there may be other revenue that relates to your recruitment efforts in one way or another. In the model, we also wanted to introduce these quantifiably elusive variables that really speak to issues that impact the success of our recruitment campaigns, but it isn't always easy to identify a number for those variables. And of course, these variables can change significantly over time. For example, what happens when a faculty member wins the Nobel Prize? Well, we can assume that the prestige factor will jump through the roof. Alumni engagement will also likely increase, as well as partnership opportunities, academic relevance, and faculty involvement. A Nobel Prize can have a very positive domino effect for recruitment. Alas, the chances of a Nobel Prize coming to campus may be remote. In my mind, efficiency of operations may very well be the variable that lies within arm's reach of controlling, and improving it can result in significant gains in ROI. In our research, and in what we'll describe in our particular hypothetical scenario, is that campus colleagues recognize their severe shortcomings. Sometimes admissions counselors do not respond promptly to student inquiries. The same data is manually entered into multiple different databases, and it takes weeks to process applications. It's just a mess, but there is a solution. So let's jump in with a hypothetical case study. Now, I know you all are queens and kings of multitasking, so I won't be offended if you hop on over to roie.com to play around with the model while I narrate. I won't get too deep into the analysis given our time limitations today, but let's say this is a 5-person office with a couple of student assistants plus a very lean budget. We've figured out our total hours. We're considering 2 markets. For example, you might want to study India and the rest of the world, however you want to define it. Then we input the number of new students. Then of course we add the outputs. And if this is our first year's analysis, there may be no auxiliary revenue, and that's okay. Then we have the corresponding revenue based on the number of incoming students. Now, the way we've structured the financial ROI is that the number reflects the result of each dollar or other monetary unit invested. And I do realize we have several colleagues from outside the US today. You can use any currency in this model as long as you're consistent throughout. So for this case study, that figure comes in at 22. We also consider the overall time ROI, which is the number of students enrolled per 100 hours invested. That figure can vary widely, especially if you have partnerships that feed scores of students to your programs on a consistent basis. Now, the real power of this tool can be seen when more than 1 year's data is considered for the same institution. Let's assume in year 2, your budget was cut 10% from about $328,000 to about $295,000. What's the first line item that is typically impacted? Travel. That drops from $41,000 to $10,000, just enough for one domestic conference for 2 people, probably going to NAFSA. And other costs drop from $7,500 to $5,000. Let's recall year 1 numbers, they're on the left in orange, in terms of costs in time. They stay the same in year 2. What has changed, not surprisingly, is the number of new students when comparing year 1 in the orange with year 2 in the yellow. Freshmen dropped a little, transfers picked up by a few given the slightly greater focus on domestic recruitment, maybe establishing agreements with local boarding schools or community colleges. Partnerships took a little bit of a hit, down from 75 to 60. There are consequences to skipping those overseas trips. New grad students dropped a little, leaving us with about a 10% decrease in the total number of new students. Coincidentally, that 10% drop in new students paralleled the 10% budget cut. Wait, I see a little question in our chat box. It is, wouldn't articulation agreements with local boarding schools or community colleges be considered partnerships, not new transfers? They certainly could be. As an institution, you get to decide. Partnerships can be defined as only overseas partnerships, or you can distinguish between overseas partnerships and domestic partnerships. Our only request is that whenever your institution decides, please be consistent over time. You can't combine overseas and domestic partnerships into one category in year 1, then change your mind to consider only overseas partnerships in year 2. That's exactly the kind of thing that kind of contaminates the data over time. So just be very deliberate when you begin the exercise. Believe me, it'll be worth it in the end. So now let's take a look at the outputs in year 2 compared with year 1. Initial revenue through tuition and fees remain the same, but in year 2, we're also considering auxiliary revenue of tuition and fees from students we recruited last year. Retention rates, based on student satisfaction, matter significantly when calculating return on investment, and this model at ROI-IE provides an opportunity to reflect that. In terms of monetary output, you'll see that all of these figures change slightly, not surprisingly, to the different numbers of incoming students, even though tuition and fees remain the same. Interestingly, the financial ROI stayed the same at 22 because of the correlated ratios. Our budget dropped 10%, and our new enrollments also dropped 10%. That makes sense as financial ROI is the result of each dollar invested. The overall time ROI, on the other hand, dipped slightly from 2.33 in year 1 to 2.11 in year 2. That's the number of students enrolled per 100 hours. So you spent the same time in years 1 and 2, you just enrolled fewer new students in year 2. Now, I won't work through this entire process again for year 3 because the overall budget stayed the same as year 2 at $295,000. In this year of the case study, we did make some minor adjustments. We took half of our marketing and communications budget, or $6,000, and moved it over into operations. Everything else stayed the same, with the exception of boosting the efficiency of our operations, in essence, streamlining the applications process, because as we all know, there's plenty of opportunity for improvement there. So again, our costs and time for year 2 remain the same for year 3. In terms of new students, we see a healthy boost in enrollments of nearly 20%. New freshmen more than doubled. Transfers were up by 12. Partnerships continue to slip, however, because we still haven't been approved to travel overseas. New grads were up slightly. Overall, the number of new students jumped from 190 in year 2 to 225 in year 3. Not surprisingly, most of the corresponding financial metrics have changed for the better, all except for partnerships. If there's any chance of salvaging those relationships overseas, then it might make sense to budget for a trip next year. You'll note that the financial ROI improved 5 points from 22 to 27, and the overall time ROI improved as well, as in year 3 we enrolled 2.5 students per 100 hours. So the ROI-IE model produces a few graphs that correspond to the data input. Here we see a positive trend in the financial ROI, for example, 22 in year 1, 22 in year 2, 27 in year 3. Now the modeled ROI and market time ROI correspond more closely with the quantifiably elusive variables we discussed earlier. In essence, these are several algorithms behind the scenes that help calculate these metrics based on the values you input in the scales at ROI-IE. This, I think, is the most fun part of the model, playing with those quantifiably elusive variables as they pertain to your particular campus. So we've identified these variables and have given you these scales to rank them in 2 different ways, from least important to most important, but also in terms of performance. How well are you doing on a scale from -10 to +10? Now, as I mentioned earlier, in year 1 of our particular hypothetical scenario, campus colleagues recognized their severe shortcomings in terms of efficiency of operations. It takes weeks to process applications. Colleagues have found that improving just one variable can significantly improve return on investment, and in the process help to simplify the entire ROI analysis. How do we get there in this industry that is so incredibly fragmented? The long-term logical solution lies in option B. Use one ecosystem where the users themselves feed data into a sophisticated silo. Data from the student along with associated expenses of attracting and recruiting that student, data from the parent or financial sponsor along with those expenses of nurturing that relationship, data from the agent or advisor or counselor along with any expenses of commissions or travel to nurture those relationships, and of course input from the admissions counselor along with associated expenses of supporting those operations, all fed into one hub with globally accepted standards. INTCAS builds intelligent communities around students, helping colleges, universities, and schools attract, recruit, and manage international students in a safe, compliant, and efficient way. So here's a 3-minute introduction.
Today, millions of students are traveling the globe for education. It's a complex industry that continues to grow as new host nations welcome international students. But in a world where overseas students can explore thousands of places to study, how do you find and attract the best students to your place of learning? And how do you run a cost-effective administration with ever-changing financial, security, and immigration rules? With 32 industries, each providing services to the student, isn't it time the global education sector worked together to make the process simpler through a single system that addresses everyone's needs? Well, now there is. INTCAS. INTCAS is a cloud-based ecosystem that allows education institutions to build and efficiently manage a global recruitment network. You can work with multiple industry stakeholders and be sure that all data and intelligence is held securely in one place, adhering to globally accepted standards and mitigating academic, financial, legal, and immigration risks. So how can we help you? Promote your institution across 88 countries, unlocking potential across new communities and allowing you to reach the student from multiple sources. Engage deeply with students, their parents, employers, or a regulated network of agents to make sure they know and understand your institution. Manage the application and admission process through a single system, allowing full transparency with each stakeholder connected to the student. Receive fees paid securely into an escrow account with all financial integrity checks made, including fraud detection, anti-money laundering, and sanction list checks. Navigate students and families through the complex immigration process through our Immigration Support Center. Connect with our employer networks to help your students engage with industry and future recruiters. Track the success of your students as they progress through life and build a career. As a whole market solution provider, our technology and support centers help institutions of all types. We have a solution for you, whether you're a public or private institution, a school, a college, or a university, a mature or new recruiter of international students, a globally ranked or a niche institution. You can enter INTCAS and work with us to pick and choose the blend of products and support centers that complement your strategy. Elevating the relationship between the institution and the student and allowing you to concentrate on what's important, delivering a quality education to the student. Join INTCAS today and become part of a united global community.
Obviously, I'm happy to speak with you more about INTCAS, but I will leave you with a few pointers related to maximizing ROI. With INTCAS, you'll have direct access to prospective students, parents, sponsors, wealth managers, and a number of other relevant communities to help achieve your recruitment goals. Our ecosystem is designed to mitigate more than 160 risks related to financial, legal, immigration, marketing, operational, and academic issues. As a matter of fact, two of our most popular functions involve helping institutions prove an applicant's financial capacity, as well as helping institutions comply with the complex immigration issues. Our ecosystem is cloud-based, so there's no complex on-site configuration from the IT perspective. It's like using Amazon or Google from any device. Perhaps most importantly for this audience, we offer a cost-effective approach that delivers a very transparent cost per student acquisition, which enables you to maximize return on investment. Of course, let me know if you'd like to learn more about INTCAS. I do hope we've shed a little light on measuring ROI so that you're more prepared for your day of reckoning when it comes time to justify the expenses in your international student recruitment budget. And while it's impractical to think that every metric can be clearly defined, we invite you to stay tuned as we develop even more sophisticated tools to identify trends over time. To continue the conversation online, just hashtag #AskINTCAS via Twitter. We do appreciate your time. Be sure to join us for our next webinar on funds verification and financial risk, other very hot topics in the industry. Do let us know if we can schedule an in-person meeting at one of the upcoming events. I will be co-presenting with some top-notch campus-based colleagues at NAFSA and AIRC, so it'd be great to see you there. We are always looking for case studies, so let us know if you'd like to participate. I will be co-presenting with Angeliki Rigos in New Orleans. She is the mathematical genius behind ROI.com. And George Kasenga will lead the session at AIRC. And if you ever have the chance to see him present, please take advantage of it. He is a real rock star when it comes to analyzing ROI data. We will also be sending you a brief survey, so we'd love it if you can take a few minutes to let us know what you think. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your week.